Welcome to the Foundry. My name is James Vanderpool and I'm the Foundry Operations Manager here at the Metal Museum. Today I'm going to show you how to make a two-part cope and drag mold using green sand. So the first thing that we start off with in the Foundry is an original pattern. We have to have an object that we're taking a mold of to basically copy in metal. Today our pattern is going to be this little crawfish. And so once we have our pattern, we look at it to make sure that it's got drafting. Drafting is kind of like an ice cube tray, how it tapers when it goes down, so that once your water freezes, you can pop your ice out. We also look for drafting on our patterns because we want to be able to pack sand around this object and remove it as cleanly as possible. With our little crawfish today, you can see he's got a flat plane on his underside. So we know that as we look at it from the side that everything above that flat plane is going to be drafted. So we know that when we pack sand on that, this crawfish is going to come out very, very cleanly. And on the other side, he's got a little cavity. So we also know that that underside is going to come out very cleanly too. So what we're going to do to establish that part line is just set it down onto a wooden board that we call a bat. And next to this crawfish, I'm going to put a little wooden chip. The wooden chip is called a gate. And what the gate does is allows metal to travel horizontally over to the cavity where the crawfish will be. It's just kind of part of the plumbing of the mold. So now that we've got our gate set right next to our crawfish, we're going to surround our pattern and gate with a metal or wooden box called a flask. Flasks, by definition, hold in liquids, and we use that term here in the Foundry because we're going to be holding in liquid metal. So we've got our flasks set right around our crawfish and our gate, and what this is going to do is add tension to the sand. The harder you pack green sand, the more it becomes firm. And so just like making a sandcastle at the beach where you pack sand into a bucket, I'm going to be using my flask to hold the tension. Today we'll be using green sand to make our mold. We really like using green sand at the Metal Museum because it's a material that can be reused. Every mold that we make here in the Foundry is a one-time shot. Once we pour metal in, we can't reuse that mold ever again. But what we can do with green sand after we pour our metal in is shake out our casting, take our sand, crush it back down, and then make another mold with it. Green sand is a mixture of sand, clay, and oil. So the clay and oil surround every grain of sand and act as binding agents so that whenever we add pressure, our sand wants to hold together very nicely. Breaks pretty cleanly in half. And this green sand has been used before, that's why it's black. When we first make it, it's actually an orange color. But before we put our green sand into our mold, it's really important that we add a parting agent. We use parting powder here at the Metal Museum, and we use it the same way that you put flour down onto your counter if you're trying to roll out dough. You do that so the dough doesn't stick to your countertop. Likewise, I'm trying to make sure that the sand doesn't stick to my pattern. So I'm going to take this bandana that's got the parting powder in it and just sprinkle a little bit in to put a barrier right on the inside. Now that I've got my parting powder in there, I'm going to take this screen. It's called a Riddle, and we use it the same way that you'd sift flour, pushing it through a screen so it makes the flour nice and fluffy and airy. It does the same thing to the sand. It aerates that sand, makes it nice and fluffy so that we can get the best detail possible. Also, since this is a reusable material, we'll have used this green sand over and over. It also helps to catch any debris that might be in that material. Things like little bits of bronze, little bits of aluminum. We want to make sure we catch all that before it goes into our mold. So we push that first layer of green sand through the riddle until we can't see our pattern anymore. This is called our facing layer. It's the layer that's touching the pattern, it's the layer that the metal's going to touch, so this is where it really gets all your detail. You just press it down a little bit, sure it up around that crawfish. And now that we've got that facing layer in there, we don't really have to put any more sand through our riddle. We can just pile it in. This is a backing layer. This is just going to reinforce that first facing. We break up any big clumps of sand with our hand and just fill this flask all the way to the top. Now that we've got sand all the way to the top, we really need to apply a lot of pressure in order to pack the sand really nice and tight. So to do that, I'm going to use a hand rammer. It's got a tapered end and a broad end on it. And the first thing I'm going to do is use the tapered end and go around all of my outside edges. It's called keying in your sides. What I'm doing is I'm going to be shoving that material up against the edges of my box, my flask, to try and lock that sand into place so that I'll be able to pick up this flask, flip it over, turn it around, and that sand's going to want to stay put. Now that I've keyed in my sides, I'm going to use the broad end of my rammer, and I'm going to ram throughout the whole mold. What I do is I go around in a spiral pattern towards the center, and I'll go once on a medium pressure, once hard. The only difference is how high I'm lifting my rammer. Now that it's all packed in, I'm going to put just a little bit more sand in so that I can have a nice flat side. We dome it up over the top, and to make a nice flat side, I'm going to switch from my hand rammer to this bit of angle iron. With our angle iron, what we're trying to do is use two sides, either the flat edge or this little beveled sharp edge that we've created. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the flat edge and pack one more time. Now I'm going to use this beveled edge, kind of like a knife. Just going to saw right through the top, cutting into that green sand to make a nice flat side. And then now, I want to go ahead and flip my mold. If I keyed in my edges correctly, I should be able to pick this flask up, flip it over, and have that sand stay in the box. Right like that. And now we're going to sneak this board right back underneath. You can see now, I've got my pattern halfway embedded in sand. And before I get on to my second side of my mold, I need to make sure that no sand crept underneath that pattern. If I go ahead and make the second side, what's going to happen when I remove my object is it'll tear sand out with it, and it'll just cause more time in the cleanup process, more time sanding, more time grinding. So we want to make as good of a mold as possible so that we don't have to spend much time later on. So I'm going to take a little hand tool that we use for cutting into the green sand, go around my outside edges to make sure that no sand crept underneath my outside. And now I'm going to go around my gate and my pattern to make sure that no sand crept under there. Just cutting away any little bits of sand. Now that we've cut down to our part line, we're going to put a second flask side on top. That's going to give us a top and bottom to our mold, or as we say in the Foundry, a cope and a drag. The cope is the top side of your mold, the drag is the bottom. Sometimes with more complicated molds that can be 15, 16 pieces, you tend to label your parts because it becomes kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. But with this, we've got two simple parts. We've got holes on this side of the flask. We've got pins on this side. And that's so that our mold registers together the same way every single time. And just like before, we're going to powder up one more time. It's really important to do that in between your two mold halves so the two halves don't stick together. And we're going to remember where that little wooden piece is, because after we pack this side of the mold, we have to be able to dig a hole straight down to that little wooden chip. Again, that's called our gate. And just like before, we're going to put our riddle on top so that we can push our first facing layer of sand through until we can't see that pattern anymore. And just like before, we're going to key in our sides and then pack throughout the whole mold. Now we'll fill it up one last time, dome up our sand above the top so that we can get another nice flat side. All right, now we've got two halves of our mold, and we're gonna end up removing that gate and removing the pattern, leaving us with a void to fill with metal. But we also have to think about how we get metal from the outside of the mold to that gate. So we're gonna carve a vertical channel called our sprue. To do that, I've got a sprue cutter. It tapers as it goes down, and it's very thin walled. And if we're teaching a class or if someone's a beginner at mold making, when they're halfway through their mold, I'll have them mark on the flask where their gate is. But when you've been doing it for a while, you tend to put the gate in the same spot every time. So I'm going to cut straight down to where I know that gate is. And because my sprue cutter is tapered, as I pull up, I can look at it. I see powder, so I know it hit halfway, and the plug comes out with the sprue cutter. Now, I'm going to give myself a bigger target to aim at. We call it a pour cup or a pour basin. And to do that, I've got a cup cutter. It works a lot like a cheese slicer. I've got these little wire pieces coming out in a funnel shape, where all I have to do is press down and twist, and it will cut a funnel shape in the top of my sprue. And the last thing I need to do before I open my mold up is make sure that there's no crumbly bits of sand around my pour cup. To do that, I've got a little bent spoon that we use as a tool to basically buff around that cup to make sure there's no little crumbly bits of sand. Now that we've got our pour cup, sprue cut, we're going to go ahead and open our mold up. Before we do that, we tap on all four corners just to make sure nothing's hanging on between the cope and the drag. So we can open it up, and you can see where that gate was and see the sprue coming in. And now we need to remove our pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is take our Foundry hammer. It's got a really thin neck, so I can't really wail on this piece. All I want to do is tap on it everywhere to loosen it up, so that it'll come out easier. Good tap on my gate as well. And now we're going to flip our pattern out. So you can see we've got a void where the pattern was. We've got the void where the gate was. and there's a little bit of sand that sometimes creeps in between the two. So very quickly I'm just going to cut that away. We're going to check the opposite side of our mold for that same little sand as well. Cut that away between the two. Make sure our open cavities are very clean, no sand in them, no loose things. So now we're ready to put our mold back together and we're ready to start our furnace. So now that our mold's made, we're over at our furnace and we'll get ready to melt our metal. As our metal heats up, you're going to see me wear a lot more safety gear. When we pour metal, we're wearing all natural fiber clothing, leather shoes, our safety glasses, of course, and gloves, but also we'll have on leather chaps to cover our legs and a full leather coat to cover our torso. And on top of the safety glasses, I'll have a full face shield and hard hat. So we've got on the inside of our furnace a ceramic cup called our crucible. We need a vessel that's going to be able to take very high temperatures without breaking down. This crucible is made out of a product called silicon carbide. And so we've got our crucible in the furnace and we're going to load up. The metal we're going to be pouring today is aluminum. Aluminum is a lower melting metal. It melts at about 1200 degrees. So we'll skim impurities off the top. Now we'll transfer the crucible from the furnace to our pouring shank using a pair of lifting tongs. And we'll secure our crucible in place with a little bit of metal on top.